Switch.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to our first 2022 BNP webinar. I have the pleasure of introducing Professor David Dunson as our speaker. David is an arts and sciences distinguished professor of statistical science at Duke University. He is a prolific author, esteemed member of our community that probably doesn't need any introduction. David's research interests include, but are not limited to, Bayesian methods for high-dimensional data, scalable algorithms, methods for spatial and dynamic data, interpretable machine learning and artificial intelligence, and applications in ecology, neuroscience, and environmental health. The title of his talk today is Bayesian Pyramids, Identifying Interpretable Structure Underlying High-Dimensional Data. David, thank you for accepting this invitation, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming David.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Felipe. And awesome if people interrupt me as we go through, make this as informal, like more people leaving their cameras on and shouting out insults or whatever as we go makes it a lot more fun and more like a real talk instead of me talking to myself in my room. And so this is a joint work with Yuki Gu, who was a really fantastic postdoc with me, who's now an assistant professor at Columbia in the stats department. And this is really, she was the leader on the work and like headed up making the slides. And the paper's under revision at JRSSB, so hopefully we'll have some luck with that. But so we were just working on the revision. So yeah. So I work a lot on latent variable models, including with some of the people in the audience. And so to just provide a kind of cartoon of the kind of old school thinking in latent variable models, we can kind of roughly categorize them as follows. And so if you have observed data that are continuous or categorical and latent variables that are continuous or categorical. And so if both the observed data and the latent variables are continuous, then that's typically known as kind of factor analysis. And so you have some latent factor, continuous factors like principal components related thing, and you're trying to explain variation in the continuous variables. If you have continuous data and you have a categorical underlying variable, a lot of us work on that in Bayesian nonparametrics, and we have maybe a mixture model, a discrete mixture model. We might be identifying kind of clusters of individuals in terms of their continuous outcome distribution. In the case where you have a continuous underlying variable and categorical outcomes, this is commonly looked at in item response theory, and so you might ask students a bunch of questions and get categorical answers to those questions, and you're interested in some latent abilities of the students. Okay? And the final case, which is more the focus today, is on latent class modeling, where you have categorical observed variables and you have a categorical underlying variable. And I'll focus throughout the talk mainly for tractability theoretically in categorical observed variables, but this type of Bayesian pyramid framework can really be applied directly beyond that setting. And I think provides a nice way to kind of go beyond historical like flat Bayesian nonparametric models where you have the observed data, you have something like this, maybe you have a cluster index underlying a bunch of observed variables, and you think of that in the context of some type of discrete mixture model, maybe a Dirichlet process mixture model or Pittman-Ure or whatever, Gibbs type. And so can we go beyond that to kind of richer structures is one of the motivations for this work. But initially, for theoretical reasons, I'm going to focus on categorical observed variables. Okay. Yes. And so in modern applications, we go from this old school latent class model where we have a single categorical latent variable. All the observed variables are conditionally independent given the categorical variables to some more intricate structure we might be interested in. And so we might replace a single categorical variable, latent variable, with multiple categorical latent variables. We might also have some type of sparse dependent structure among the categorical, between the categorical variables and the observed variables to give us more flexibility. And we might even farther think that we might want to have some multi-layer structure, maybe a little bit even maybe motivated by the neural network literature, deep learning literature. It's been quite popular to describe these kind of multi-layer models for data, and those have been quite successful as kind of black box for characterizing dependent structures and complicated data and for predicting certain variables given other variables. Okay, but if we do something like this, then it gets pretty complicated, and the question might be that can we actually identify this structure? So 99.99% of the time in machine learning, when we fit a deep neural network or something like that, we really can't interpret the latent structure at all, because it's not identifiable, it's not reproducible. Every time we run the model from a different starting point, we might get different estimated parameters, and we might not care about that. We just care about some induced predictive distribution. But today, what I'm really interested in is I don't want to do prediction. I want to do interpretable inferences about structure and data. So I would like to do something like, in a simple case, we might want to just cluster the data, but I would like to do something more nuanced than just simple clustering of data, because that's just too simple often. And so if we have, high dimensional data, a bunch of categorical variables, then just saying like, oh, well, this vector categorical variables is in one of these 5 categories, 5 clusters, is too simplistic, I think. And so instead, I'd like to say, okay, well, maybe we have multiple layers of latent categorical variables that are describing the data. And one application I've been motivated by, which I won't get into too much today, is by collaborations in ecology. And so you might imagine that the Y1 through YP are indicators of which species occur at a given sample. And so I go out in the field somewhere, into the forest, and I observe whether each of P species of birds are present or not. Okay, and I do that many times at many different sampling locations across the region. Those sampling locations might have different characteristics, and so I could imagine like something people do in ecology is they would just maybe cluster the sampling locations according to the habitat. If a certain species tend to occur at that location, they might have a particular habitat. So you could do that just having the Z underlying the Y1 through the YP. And there was a session at the last JSM on that in statistical ecology, but that would be just too simple. I mean, really, we can't just like roughly categorize it like that. We might want to do it in a hierarchical way and say like, okay, well, maybe Z, this deep categorical variable, is just roughly what type of habitat it is. Is it a forest? Is it an aquatic environment? Is it on some sort of mountainous region? Is it a prairie? But that's not enough information really to tell you what birds are there. And so underlying that, like, well, within forests there might be some subtypes, and so you get this kind of more nuanced structure. So that's the kind of thinking I've been thinking about. Also, I find that if we do clustering of high-dimensional data, say using Bayesian nonparametric methods, it tends to be very flaky and brittle. We might get too many clusters, they might not be very interpretable. And so I don't want to just have one Z underlying the Ys, which is what we're doing almost all the time in Bayesian nonparametrics. Okay, so just a glance at what we mean by Bayesian pyramids. And so we have this potentially deep, using this kind of terminology from machine learning, sparse directed graph with discrete latent variables. And so we have at the kind of top of the pyramid, we have the Z, which is a categorical latent variable. The daughters of that are binary latent variables. And so the alphas and then daughters of those are binary. And then finally, eventually, we have the observed data layer, which are the Y1 through YP. Okay, so our research questions are sort of theoretically when and what types of discrete latent structures can lead to model identifiability. Because if I can't actually identify the discrete structure and the other parameters characterizing the model, including the discrete structure, then it's not going to be very reliable inferences, is it? I mean, like every time I do it, I might get a different answer. If I run Bayesian methods, it might never converge. It's kind of floating between different types of latent structures underlying the data. That's not going to be a very good recipe for getting anything interpretable, even in an exploratory data analysis type setting. And so we really want it to be identifiable. That's crucial. Okay. Otherwise, this type of framework might still be useful as a generative model for categorical data, but it's not going to be useful in terms of trying to interpret the latent structure in the data. Okay, and then the second question that we'll be talking about today is methodologically, then what do we do to infer the latent structure in the model parameters? Okay. And I'm going to start out with the theoretical question. And then please, again, stop me at any time with questions, clarifications, insults, whatever. Okay, so when and what type of discrete latent structures can lead to model identifiability? And so I'll kind of break this up into two parts. I'll first talk about Bayesian pyramids, and then we're going to kind of solve the problem by saying that let's go back. The Bayesian pyramids, we have this complicated structure. We can actually express a Bayesian pyramid as a special case of a latent class model, a constrained latent class model. So latent class model, we have a single Z underlying the observed data, which is categorical. So that's a latent class model. If we have that model, but then we put in a particular set of constraints, then we can get back the Bayesian pyramid. And so if we can show identifiability for some identifiability conditions for a constrained latent class model, then that will also cover Bayesian pyramids as well as other things we could do in terms of elaborations on latent class models. Okay, so some comments on the Bayesian pyramids. The first thing that you might notice is that it's not really a tree structure, it's a pyramid because you can kind of cross over. Also, the graph here is describing the conditional independent structure in the data. And so you could say that, like, the y's, they're all conditionally independent of each other. The distribution of a given y only depends on the parents, and so that like a y is conditionally independent of all the ancestors and all of the aunts and uncles, conditional on the parents. And so that's the kind of structure in the data. We have this kind of conditional independent structure described by this graphical model that I'm plotting here. And so some of the pieces are the Z, which is a categorical latent cluster, you could think, and then the alphas on each layer, which are binary, and the G's. Okay, the G's are a sparse graphical connection matrix, which are just describing the relationships between the layers, and so that describes which variables have edges between them. Okay. So there's a 1 in the G matrix if there's an edge between two nodes, and a 0 otherwise. And so the G superscript 1 is going to describe the relationship, the edges between one layer deep and the observed data level. G superscript 2 will describe the graphical relationship between 3 layers deep and 2 layers deep, etc. Okay. And then we'll just do fully connected between Z and the first layer. Okay, so I said that stuff already, so I'll skip through that. Okay, and so what are the other ingredients to the model? Well, we have this whole Bayesian pyramid thing, and then we need to describe the distributions of the data and the latent variables. Okay. And so on the observed data layer, given the graphical structure, we just need to describe the distribution of the y's given the alphas. Okay, so the alpha is 1 layer deep. That's alpha superscript 1. And so that is going to be just a product from j equals 1 to p over the different categorical variables of the conditional distribution of the jth variable given the parents of the jth variable, that's just the alpha subscript pa for parent of j, 1. Okay. So we need to put a model on that, and then in the mth latent layer, so if we go like a given layer up, then the binary latent variables at the mth layer given the m plus first layer is again just going to have this kind of simple product conditional independence form. And so the model, conditionally on the graphical structure, ends up being quite simple. And so then we have this kind of general Bayesian pyramid thing. And so as a theorem, you could say, okay, suppose the G's are the graphical matrices describing the connections across the layers of the Bayesian pyramid. So GM is describing the connections between layer M and M plus 1. So let's suppose that we can permute the rows of the GM, and so that it has this form, okay? And we can relax this condition later, and we do in the paper as well. Okay, and so if it has this form where you can stack identity matrices and then you have a matrix having an arbitrary form, then the following pieces are identifiable up to the usual kind of label ambiguity, which is like a latent variable permutation within each layer, okay? So we can identify the probability distribution tau of the z, of the deepest latent variable. So that's a categorical variable. The tau is just going to give the probability z takes a value 1, 2, blah, blah, blah. We can identify the conditional distribution of each of the variables in the table given as parents. And we can also identify the graphical matrices linking the parents and the children at each layer. And so that's pretty awesome, actually. So we can identify all the continuous parameters characterizing the Bayesian pyramid, but also the structure of the pyramid itself. Okay. So this I said that already, and so we'll get back to the proof intuition later. So this is for Bayesian pyramids. So when we're doing the pyramid in practice, before if I go back to like here, okay, so now we have these arbitrary P of Y given alphas and P of alphas given alpha parents. So we need to put some particular form on those conditional probabilities in order to actually implement it in practice. Okay. And so what we've considered various choices. The one we'll focus on in practice, because we find that more elaborate kind of interaction models, et cetera, it's just too much, I think, is this so-called main effect model. And so we have some generalized linear model. F is just some link function in a generalized linear model. Here I'm describing the conditional probability that in layer M of the pyramid, the kth binary latent trait takes value 1, conditionally on the parents, that's alpha m plus 1, conditionally on the connection with the parents, which is G, and conditionally on some parameters describing the impact of the connection with the parents. Okay, well that we're just going to put as a really simple form. There's like a baseline parameter, and then there's just a sum over all of the parents. So k prime such that jkk prime equals 1. That just is saying that, okay, I'm just taking this sum over the parents of the kth node in layer M that are connected. So they're connected, so they're parents of that node. Okay, and then the alpha is just like, do they have that trait? And the beta is like the impact of having that trait of the parent. Okay, so it's a simple model. We could do some more parsimonious model where we just say, oh, there's 2 values and it depends on whether we have a parent or not, but we're going to focus on the main effect model. You can do more complicated things. We also have considered interaction models where you have more complicated forms, but I don't know how useful those are going to be in practice. So if we do this main effect model and then we make F like a logistic regression, then the Bayesian pyramid looks a lot like a deep belief network, which is something that's been quite popular type of neural network in machine learning. But for deep belief networks, they don't have the pyramid form. Often if you're doing a multi-layer network, you just have a bunch of nodes at each layer, and I don't know how many layers, I don't know how many nodes, and I don't know what the kind of structure of the network is, and you just like tune all of that based on predicted performance or something like that. And they also don't specify it in a way so that it is actually a coherent generative model. And it's certainly not identifiable, or they have no idea how to put in identifiability constraints. And so the actual form of the pyramid, where we have fewer on each level going up to the root node, is completely related to identifiability. That we put that structure on so that we can actually identify all the parameters in the links. If you do some arbitrary thing where you have like arbitrary number of variables going up, then you're not going to be able to identify all that structure. Okay. So some other connections to existing stuff. So in psychometrics, there's what's called cognitive diagnostic models. And so you can imagine, like, let's say I want to assess a bunch of students in terms of their math ability. And you give them some comprehensive mathematics exam, and it might be that you have you can imagine having a bunch of binary traits on whether or not they've mastered a certain concept in mathematics, whether they can do a certain matrix operation, or they can do a certain type of integration, or they can do a certain type of differentiation. And so that could be like our alphas, basically, a bunch of indicators whether they've mastered those traits. And then if they have mastered those traits, maybe they get the questions right, that require you to have that knowledge of that mathematical operation. Okay. And so they use those models a lot in psychometrics, and what they do is they actually fix the G matrix in that case. They only go one layer deep, and so they don't have a whole pyramid, and they would fix the matrix because you're like, okay, well this question requires you to have these skills, and so I would fix the kind of loadings matrix in advance. So the G would be fixed, and then it would be more like a confirmatory factor analysis, where our method is like an exploratory method where we can actually learn the structure. We're not actually imposing the loading structure in advance. Okay. In machine learning, but beyond deep belief networks, there's things like latent tree models and some product networks that share a lot of characteristics with these kind of Bayesian pyramids. But again, they're sort of these kind of non-identifiable black box type prediction machines. Okay, so our first main question of the talk was when and what types of discrete latent structures can lead to model identifiability. And so we can do that for Bayesian pyramids by turning the Bayesian pyramid into a constrained latent class model. The constrained latent class model is actually a type of constrained tensor decomposition, and then the mathematics involved is essentially like algebra for tensor decompositions, and that's what we use to kind of show these theorems. Okay, so a latent class model is just one layer deep, and so we have a bunch of y's. Underlying that, we have a z, which takes some values, 1 to k. Okay. And the probability that z takes value h is nu h. The probability distribution on the y's conditionally on a given value for z is just expressed through the lambdas. So lambda j cj h, that's the probability that the jth categorical variable takes level cj in latent class h. Okay. So this is a very common classical model. There's a non-parametric Bayesian version that we published in JASA, it's like Dunson Zing paper in 2009. That allows it to be infinity, et cetera. Okay. So a constrained latent class model, we're going to put some constraints on, and so we can introduce this constraint matrix S, which is P by K. The P is the number of categorical variables, K is the number of levels of the latent class. And we're going to say that SJH1 equals SJH2 equals 0. That implies some equalities among the lambdas. Okay. And so that's this constraint matrix. And so then by moving around the constraints, we can define like a broad class of constrained latent class models. Okay, so these constrained latent class models lend themselves directly to generalizations to deep layers, and so you can actually, you remember the G's in the Bayesian pyramid. The G's and the alphas are going to actually have a direct relationship with S, and so if we have the G's and alphas, we can map to S and define a corresponding latent class model. Okay, and so to give a little toy version, let's just say we have a Z, and then we just have we have just a simple Bayesian pyramid, and then we have this G, which is encoding the connections between the alpha layer and the Y layer. This G, which is 3 by 2. Okay, and the alphas are binary, and so then there's 4 possible configurations of alpha 1 and alpha 2, and so if we have this this particular structure, then it's going to imply a type of S constraint as we've defined it in the previous slide. Okay, so let's kind of write down the distribution of the observed data, and so the kind of likelihood of the data. Well, this is just going to be in this form. That's just the same thing as I shown before, and so we have these nus or the weights, probability weights on the different classes. Lambdas are the probabilities of each of the observed variables given the latent class allocation, or the tensor arms in the tensor case. And we can write this as a pth order probability tensor, a type of CP factorization of a probability tensor. And so we have, the joint probability mass function can be expressed as this tensor outer product. So we have a kind of a rank K tensor factorization. Okay. And so now we're in the land of a tensor, and then if we have a constrained tensor, a CP decomposition, if we're then imposing constraints S. And so the constraints S are going to imply a particular set of equality constraints among the lambdas. Okay. Yeah, so I'll just, I kind of want to give just a little bit of a sketch of the theory. A lot of this kind of non-parametric Bayes crowd is used to this posterior concentration theory, but hasn't seen this type of identifiability theory. So I'll just give a little bit of sketch of some of the pieces, and then we'll kind of go back to actually the modeling and applications. And so a key piece is this Cattry-Rao product, and so column-wise Kronecker product. And so we just define that this way in general. And then this is a proposition, so about a non-trivial algebraic structure of constrained latent class models. Okay. So we're going to say lambda j, that's like all the stuff in lambda related to the jth categorical variable. And so we're going to take a Cattry-Rao product over those lambda j's. And so then, if the k column vectors of the constraint matrix S are distinct, then K, this Cattry-Rao product, must have full column rank, K. And then B, if S contains identical column vectors, then K can be rank deficient, okay? And so here we can see that the constraint matrix is going to have this direct kind of simple effect on the Cattry-Rao product of the lambdas. So a proposition is that connecting Bayesian pyramids would be, okay, so we consider a Bayesian pyramid with D latent layers. We have these binary graphical matrices, G describing the connections between the different layers. So this allows us to link, this proposition is going to allow us to link Bayesian pyramids with constrained latent class models. Okay. So if we just marginalize out all the latent variables except the ones just one layer beneath Y, then the corresponding constraint matrix S1 is going to be determined by the bipartite graph between the alpha and the Y layers, and the entries of that S are going to be as follows. And so we can just define them as indicators depending on the alphas and the G's. And so we have a simple way to kind of map between the S's and the G's. This is one part of the S, but we can then go on to go across the different layers to define a link between the S and the G's. And this is just involves intricate algebra to kind of figure out this kind of relationship. Okay, so that's cool. So then if we have this toy example, we can say, oh, we have this G matrix, which is describing the links between the alphas and the Y's. Well, we can induce an actual S matrix from that. Okay, so that's cool. Okay, so then that allows us to kind of, think about identifiability of constrained class models, and that'll automatically imply identifiability of Bayesian pyramids. So a constraint latent class model is strictly identifiable, which is a strong notion of identifiability, if for any valid parameters lambda, S, the S is that constraint binary matrix, and nu, then we can't change around those parameters at all, or we're going to change the resulting joint probability mass function of the Y's. Okay, so that's what we mean by strict identifiability. So a theorem that we proved is that if we consider a constraint latent class model with these parameters, and then we consider a partition of the integers from 1 to p, indexing the different variables, such that the submatrix S corresponding to the first partition, the ith partition, has distinct column vectors for I equals 1 to 2, and we also have this condition. The condition on a new H being greater than 0 is like trivial, because if it was 0, then we would just have one less latent class level. Okay, so under those conditions, then these parameters are strictly identifiable. Okay. So you can also define slightly stronger but easily checkable conditions for identifiability. So if we have, again, the nus are bigger than 0, if we can define a partition such that each submatrix has distinct column vectors, then nu, lambda, and S are strictly identifiable. Okay. So the condition above only depends on the structure of the binary constraint matrix, and it just requires that after some column permutation, S should vertically stack 3 submatrices, each of which has distinct column vectors. Okay. And so we can get these kind of constraints automatically in Bayesian pyramids. And they also imply posterior consistency. I won't even go over that because it's sort of trivial. Like once we have identifiability, then we can actually consistently estimate all the parameters in a Bayesian sense. Okay, are there any quick questions or non-quick questions about the identifiability part? Otherwise, like maybe most of you will probably be more interested in the kind of methodology part and like how do we define our Bayesian model? How do we do the sampling? What are the applied results, et cetera? Any questions about the identifiability? I should mention that in the paper, I'll mention a little bit more about identifiability specifically for the type of model that we'll be implementing, because then we have weaker conditions. In the paper, we also have additional theorems on identifiability under weaker conditions. And we show that you don't really even need to impose, like once you have the pyramid structure, you don't need to impose any restriction on the prior for identifiability in order to identify the parameters. And so that's a really cool thing. We don't need some elaborate restriction. Like if we run the latent class model, constrained latent class model in a Bayesian way, we have to put this restriction on S, and that makes computation really difficult, efficient computation. But one of the cool things about Bayesian pyramids is we set up the Bayesian pyramid in such a way that we don't have to do that. We can just run a trivial, not entirely trivial, but simple Gibbs sampler without any constraint. Yeah, David.
My sense is this is going to be data hungry. In order to try and fit any sort of slightly complicated model, you're going to need a lot of data in order to estimate these things. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I'll show a little bit on how well you're going to do. I think that. I think that if you have a tiny amount of data, then you would like to let the structure get richer as you get more data, because how well are you going to be able to estimate like G's 3 layers deep if you only have sample size of 20 or something? That's going to be pretty limited probably. But the asymptotics kick in reasonably quickly. I'll show, particularly if you use as a default a kind of 3-layer Bayesian pyramid. I think that's a really nice model. If you go to like 4 layers, it's A, going to be harder computationally, but then B, you're asking a lot of your data to kind of identify and figure out all of these parameters across layers. And so I think as an applied node, I think that having the Y's, 1 layer of alphas, Z, as a default is a really nice model in general for categorical data. And if your sample size is like 100 or something, you can do better with that model, I think, often than if you just have ZY.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
David, there is a question in the chat. It says, do you have a sense of how crucial the conditional independence layering structure in the pyramid is for identifiability? If you allowed connections between non-agented layers, could you?
Yeah, I got it.
Relationships still identifiable. Yeah.
That's a fantastic question. It's completely, utterly crucial for identifiability. The conditional independence layering structure in the Bayesian pyramid is everything. If you wanted a more elaborate structure, you could do that. And then you would have to like carefully look at the relationship between that more elaborate structure and the constrained latent class model, making sure that you have sufficient constraints. Because if you're going to allow more flexibility, well, does that flexibility actually buy you something? And is it still identifiable? That's going to be. Sure you could work through it, but if you have a more elaborate dependent structure, then you're going to have to put in more constraints somewhere else.
Thanks.
Anything else? Okay, let's go to the methods part, which I imagine more people will find interesting. Okay, so I think that this is really our canonical model in practice. I think as you go to deeper things, then I don't know whether it's all that useful. Maybe it is in certain settings where you have very big data sets or very high dimensional data. Okay, so this is the kind of 2 latent layer Bayesian pyramid. So Z is a 1 to B categorical variable, latent variable. And then we have K binary variables that are daughters of Z. And then we have the Y's. Okay, so that's our kind of what we'll be focusing on methodologically. Okay, and then so we need to kind of parameterize stuff, and so first let's look at the link between the y's, the observed y's, and then one layer deeper, okay, which is the alphas. Okay, so we're just going to do logistic regressions there, and the GJK, that's just a binary links between it's. And the alphas are just an indicator whether we have that trait or not, and then the betas are the impact of that trait. Okay. Yeah. So we described this model already, and then so here we're going to have that structure, but then as we go deeper, as we go from the alpha to the z, we're going to make that part like completely non-parametric. And so we're going to say z, well, z just has some probability mass function. We're going to infer the number of layers, b, capital B, and we're going to infer the probability that z takes each value from 1 to capital B. Okay? And we're also going to have an unspecified Bernoulli distribution that's completely flexible for alpha given each level of z. So to describe that, that's just here. So we have the probability that the alphas, I'm just using AI, and then the alpha is like the value that the ith person's binary indicator vector is AI. It's notation. So the probability that binary indicator vector takes value alpha, that's just like a sum over the different latent class levels, the probability you have a given level of latent class, and then just like, the probability you have a binary indicator given that the deep latent class was a given level. So that's just, takes the form of just a mixture of Bernoullis. Okay, so that's just a very, very generic non-parametric specification for the top part of the pyramid. Okay, so to just note, for this particular model, you can actually relax our identifiability conditions. Generic identifiability is weaker than strict identifiability, which is what we showed before. That it just says that, okay, well, now we allow a measure 0 subset with respect to the Lebesgue measure at which we don't have identifiability, which makes no practical difference. I think generic identifiability is fine for practical purposes. And so under that, we have this very weak condition on G. Remember, a while ago, we had this stacking identity matrices on G. We can massively relax that for this particular Bayesian pyramid using the logistic regressions. And we just have this very general form on the G's. We just have to be able to like have ones along the diagonal, and everything else can be anything at all, binary indicators of any form. So, and as long as K1 is big enough relative to B in this sense, then we're good. We're identifiable. So it's a very, very weak condition. Okay, so we have two algorithms for that we implemented. The one is if we fix the number of binary latent traits. Okay, and so you can imagine that, okay, we're running this. Well, it might be hard to like figure out how many binary traits we have. And so maybe we'll just like do some cross-validation or something and punt on that initially. Initial implementation, we tried it that way. So it just, fix K at 5 or whatever. And so if we do that, then, okay, well, we have the G's, the indicators of the links, and we'll just put a Bernoulli prior on that with some gamma prior that there's a link between the alphas and each alpha and a Y. They're just independent Bernoulli. We'll put a beta hyper prior on gamma. And then we have these betas are describing the impact of having a link on the probability distribution. And for those, we're just going to give them a particular prior. It turned out to work really well computationally. And so if GJK is equal to 1, then beta JK, JCK actually comes into the likelihood. And so that's sort of a real prior. If beta JCK, if the GJK is equal to 0, then the normal prior is a pseudo prior because that beta JCK doesn't actually come into the likelihood. And so if we would, in general, we would set the V naught squared, the pseudo prior variance equal to some small value. It tends out to be not very sensitive to how small it is. And then we can run a simple Gibbs sampler. through a kind of spike and slab with this kind of pseudo prior, okay, where we're multiplying beta jk by this gjk, and then we run a Gibbs sampler, and it tends to work quite well doing that. I promised before the talk that I would cite Sirio, who's in the audience. It's a wonderful work, and so he has a nice paper in Biometrica in 2020 on what he calls the cumulative shrinkage process, which is they were motivated by factor modeling, where you wanted to have a nice prior that can figure out how many factors you have in a continuous factor model. So Yuki figured out a way to modify the cumulative shrinkage process in a quite straightforward way, so that we could use it to figure out how many binary latent factors we have in our Bayesian pyramid. Okay, and so so the K star, we have some upper bound, say, on the number of binary latent factors that you can set to be whatever, and then now we can infer the some unknown K star, which is the number of factors that actually come in through this a type of cumulative shrinkage process prior. Okay, it's kind of related to stick breaking. Okay, and so then we end up with this Gibbs sampler. So we use the Polya gamma data augmentation, wonderful trick by Nick Poulsen and colleagues, combined with this auxiliary variable trick for multinomial logit models by Holmes and Held, and so that we have a kind of data augmentation Gibbs sampler, and then we use this cumulative shrinkage process prior of Sirio, and now we have just a simple Gibbs sampler. Under this prior, you can get an induced, prior expected number of latent binary factors, and we can also infer the number of categories of the Z, this kind of deep latent class variable, and we could do this in a Bayesian non-parametric way. We chose to use this overfitted mixture approach of Rousseau and Mengerson and Jarris's B. I really like this approach. It tends to work really quite nicely in practice and be simple to implement. You just put in too many levels of the categorical variable, and then you just have a shrinkage prior kill off the ones that you don't need. Okay, this worked really well. I thought the mixing would be terrible, and it surprisingly wasn't. I think if you added other layers to it, like a 4-layer, 5-layer Bayesian pyramid, I would guess that the mixing of this type of algorithm would blow up and be awful. But for this kind of 3-layer, the mixing's quite good in our experience. Okay, so we ran a simulation study. This gets a little bit at David's question about how fast does the asymptotics kick in. So the true structure is on the right, and then we ran a simulation for different sample sizes. On the left side, the sample size is 500. And this shows the beta JK, and so the beta JK including the G part, and so that the G, if the G is 0, the beta JK should be 0. And so there's a bunch of zeros, and then there's some true values of the non-zeros. And we can see that we do pretty darn well even for n equals 500, and then as n equals 2000, we nail it perfectly. For n equals 500, some of the ones, the true zeros, where you can see a little yellowish tint, that corresponds to a little bit of overestimation. We estimate it's still low, but not really close to 0. Because some of those there's some uncertainty in the G's, and so all the G's aren't like probability 1 at 0 until we get higher sample size. Okay, and so then we could look at the errors estimating the G. This really directly gets at David's question, and so so if we had quite a small sample size, we did poorly. If we have a quite small sample size at estimating G, but then as the sample size goes up, we do really well, and so at some point we do perfectly, like after sample size 700 or something. And so you might think, well, 700 is pretty large, but here we're considering a contingency table that's each categorical variable has 4 levels, and there's 20 categorical variables. And so the number of cells in that contingency table is actually of the order of 10 to the 12th, which is enormous. And so that's like ridiculously huger than 750. And so it's an extremely sparse data that we have, and so 750 sample size is tiny relative to the number of cells in the table, and we're still kind of doing quite well. But yeah, if you have a sample size 100, you're probably not going to be able to learn the latent structure here. The continuous parameters we also did quite well, and then it kicked, as sample size got to 500, 600, we were doing extremely well, and then less well at 100. Okay, and so we have this example. We've also applied it a lot to these ecology examples, but those are more complicated to present. So I'm gonna focus on these kind of publicly available nucleotide sequence data, which are called the splice data. So there's regions which are removed during our RNA transcription process, introns, and there's regions which are used to generate mRNA exons, and then there's junctions between intron and exons, which are splice junctions. And so the splice junctions have three types. There's the EI, IE, and neither EI or IE, N. Okay, and so we have this kind of, for these data, some people use this for classification. We have a nucleotide sequence, so ACGT, a bunch of different loci. For each of those nucleotide sequences, we have a label, whether it's EI, IE, or N. We're going to hold out that label, run it, and then see if it can infer those labels, and see what else it infers using this kind of Bayesian pyramid method. And I'm not going to show the results here, but something I was really interested in is that it actually, if you look at how well it does at kind of capturing the EI, IE, or N, if you do one layer, if you get rid of the alpha layer, and so you just have Z underlying Y, that's just like a typical model that you could just use the Dunson-Zing-Jassa method or whatever. And so if you do that, it does a worse job clustering. So the clusters, the true clusters we would like to be corresponding to these EI, IE, and N, it doesn't do as good a job at that if you do one layer as if you do a pyramid, if you do a 3-layer structure. But anyway, so let's get to it. Okay, so this is in the UCI machine learning repository. I should say all of the code are publicly available. I'd love to have people try out this kind of Bayesian pyramid and see when it works or doesn't work. There's a bit over 3,000 nucleotide sequence. Each has links 60, which is pretty high dimensional for categorical data if you have some unordered and with 4 levels, etc. Okay, so here's the type of the data. So the data looks like this, and so there's a type, this EI, IE, and N. There's also a sequence name, which will end up being, I don't actually know much about this, but it ends up being that our binary traits that we infer actually match a lot attributes of this sequence name, which is pretty cool. And we have this sequence data. It's just ACGT, that's the nucleotides. So 4-level. So what do? So we applied our Bayesian procedure with the Serios cumulative shrinkage process prior, and we obtained 5 binary indicators when we did that. Okay. So that's the alpha level of our Bayesian pyramid. We use only the nucleotide sequence data, and we take 3 Bayesian. I should say that in separate results not presented here, we actually also inferred B, and we actually inferred B to be 3. And so, if you learn B, it's 3. So what are we going to do? So we're going to use the nucleotide sequence, and we're going to take the Z's, and then we're going to hold out the sequence information, and then we're going to see whether or not our inferred alphas and Z's relate to the sequence labels that we held out. But we're doing unsupervised learning. Okay. So some overview of some of the results. We get these kind of G's and A's and Z's. And so here shows the different locations in the first, the G matrix, and then we have these 5 binary latent variables, and there's a lot of loadings, and so the pyramid is pretty richly linked. In terms of the A, a lot of the binary latent variables are turned on. The 5th, it seems like half of them are turned on, half of them aren't. If we look at the Z, the Z is maybe the most interesting because you can see that it's sort of picking up 3 groups. And so if we look at the 3,000 sequences, there's a block that are in the first the Z is 1, there's a block of Z is 2, and there's a block of Z is 3. It's not perfect, but it lines up. Those blocks are actually corresponding to those held out labels. Okay. Okay, so the splice data. So the G describes how the 60 loci load on the binary latent traits. I'm going to skip. I sort of said some of these things already, but yeah. So I kind of commented on this. So I wanted to kind of get to the. What did we do? Okay, so we wanted to then we took the learned binary latent traits. So we had 3 levels of the Z, and we had 5 binary indicator variables. And so what we did is we built a classifier for assessing how our Z and alphas performed in classifying EI, IE, and N. Okay, the held out labels. And so how do we do that? So we use the rules list approach, which is an interpretable classification method based on a categorical features, and it finds simple deterministic rules. And so when we do that, so for each sequence from our estimated A and our estimated Z, we define these kind of learned latent features, okay? And so we have our latent features, and then we have a held out true label. And now we're going to build this kind of rule list classifier to see how well our inferred latent features relate to these kind of true held out labels. So our kind of visual inspection just shows that there's a very clear distinction between the latent features for the 3 types of nucleotide sequences. And this distinction is less good if you get rid of the alpha layer, which is pretty consistent with my intuition. The rule list approach outputs this simple rules, which are pretty awesome, I think. But so it says that we're EI if the first latent feature is 1 and the 5th latent feature is 1. We're IE if ZI is 1, ZI2 is 1, and we're in the neither category in this case. So it's a very simple rule. Okay. Amazingly, the downstream classification accuracy was 95%, and so we didn't use the label at all in training the algorithm, and so that accuracy was the same as if we took the data and we and tuned the crap out of a neural network for classification. So that was pretty cool. I think that it actually learned these latent features underlying the observed nucleotide sequence data. Those very simple low-dimensional latent features were actually mapped really well to the held-out labels of the different sequence types. The other thing that was cool was that if we looked carefully at the A's, they actually matched the names that we didn't use at all formally, but that one column of data on the names of the different sequences. So it seemed like we were learning something actually quite relevant. Okay, so I'm out of time, so I'll just say that we developed a quite general theory for identifiability in constrained latent class models, including Bayesian pyramids. And we have a quite nice Gibbs sampler, kind of default Bayesian implementation, which I'm hoping that people can build on and start to even consider these kind of Bayesian non-parametric methods in a multi-layer way. And I'll stop there.
Okay, let's thank David for this presentation. And well, we do have time for questions. So are there any questions or comments for David? If so, please turn on your mic and go ahead. Or you can also raise your hand.
I have may I?
Sure, please go ahead.
But it's very good. I liked a lot, David. Thank you for the talk. And a question that came to my mind: would it be the case that you have some covariates, some some of the beginning you said the forest or so. So could it be a sort of mix of latent and observable variables, or would it go
Yeah,
too far?
that's a great question. Definitely, and I had thought of that, and so it's a nice thing is that it becomes quite easy to put in covariates. I mean, we have these, we have the Z's and the alphas. I mean, you can just put in covariates affecting those, and so you could imagine that maybe I have some environmental covariates, and so you could think of Z in the ecology example as being some coarse habitat types. But well, I know stuff about that sampling location, and so that should be covariates informing those habitat types, and so I could put in a logistic regression or something there instead of just having an unstructured categorical variable. And similarly, I could do such things for the binary traits as well. It'd be quite easy to modify the model to put in covariates. That's a great suggestion.
Thank you.
I think also the identifiability theory could be extended.
Yeah, that's interesting, identifiability, because we overlook it often.
Okay. Any other questions, comments for David? Maybe I can ask like a quick question, David. So you make a reference of this paper where you use like this mixture of a product of multinomials. That basically, I get that it's the same model that you don't have the alpha layer. Yeah. And I remember that something that is cool about that work is like if the B goes to infinity, then you can achieve like full support in that context. So in this case, if we fix B and we increase the number of alpha layers or the number of alphas in each layer, can we achieve a similar like property in terms of support?
I mean, certainly if we allow B to be unbounded, then we can achieve that same property. If we don't, but we allow the alpha layer to be unbounded, we should be able to still, yeah, I think that's trivial. It's probably, well, straightforward to show that we can still achieve that property as long as we allow the K1 to be unbounded. The Z can just take a couple levels, and then the alpha layer could blow up the number of binary variables, and then you're fine for flexibility. Yeah. That's a great question.
Thank you. So if any other questions, comments, Daniele?
Yeah, can I ask one?
Please.
So I was just curious, can you also learn how much deep you want to go? I mean, maybe most of the times you don't need it in application, but I was wondering whether you can also include that as a parameter to learn, which is also related to another curiosity that I had is whether you can use, like, for example, priors that has been developed for trees, like regression trees or for classification trees, like Chipman type prior for trees to include in this model to learn the tree structure.
Yeah, I mean the structure is not a tree, and so it's not exactly a tree. Yeah, I mean I thought about that, like kind of learning the number of layers. I think that's just going to be really challenging computationally. I mean, one thing that's like really fun and interesting is that it's just really hard to run efficient MCMC algorithms to kind of move around efficiently and mix discrete structure. I think Giacomo in your department is quite interested in that sort of thing, and he's written some nice work, but we try his algorithms and they don't kind of work in these more elaborate cases so much. And so I think that we need better MCMC algorithms or computational algorithms to allow us to more efficiently mix discrete structure well beyond anything to do with Bayesian pyramids. And I think if we have something like that, then that frees us up to think about more elaborate models that have more layers. I think that if we're like, moving between 5 and 8 and 10 layers or something for some giant data set, this MCMC algorithm we propose isn't going to work at all. It's not going to work at all. So, and I'm super interested. We've been talking to people in the math department. We've been looking at all these sort of crazy algorithms like normalizing flows and teleporting walkers and various things to try to get things to mix better for discrete latent structure. And that I would say is like an open problem in Bayesian computation. and we would be waiting on that. So I'm super happy that this kind of 3-layer thing mixes so well in our experience, and so because I think the 3-layer model is super useful, and it's just a completely separate problem to like actually go deep.
Thanks.
Okay, so let me see. Anybody else?
Ask just one question.
Oh, please.
Would it make sense to consider like the variable in the intermediate layers to be like to take more categories than just 2, or it doesn't add anything, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's sort of like if we had more than 2, then you could decrease the number of variables, but would that add something? I mean, it's convenient computationally to have 2 as a default, and then like if you're trying to learn the number of layers or something, I mean, that would be hard to say, like learn whether it's like, do we have 3, like two variables of 3 levels versus like more binary. I think that's not well identified, that question, I would think. And so I think it's quite nice from an interpretation standpoint to just make it 2. And I'm not optimistic that it would add much to allow more than 2 levels. But maybe it would.
Thanks.
Well, let's thank David for this presentation. I want to please recall that the recording of this presentation will be available at the ISBA YouTube channel. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Felipe. Thanks, everybody.